Hey guys, tonight we're starting somewhere cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your gloves, bites through the seams of your boots, and turns your breath into tiny clouds that float up and disappear like startled ghosts. You're standing just outside a medieval castle, one of those solid, slightly grumpy-looking stone beasts with a moat circling it like a protective shrug. Except tonight, something is off. The water isn't moving. It's glassy still, and when you shuffle a bit closer and nudge it with your boot, there's a soft crack. That moat. It's frozen. You probably won't survive this if you were hoping for sword fights or high-stakes diplomacy. This is the kind of story where the drama comes from melting slush and the accidental economics of salt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is over there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You notice the frost along the ramparts first. It laces the stone like a delicate embroidery, and it's almost pretty if you ignore what it means. Because if your castle's moat is frozen over, you've got a handful of very practical problems. Namely, you're easier to invade than usual. A moat is supposed to be a deterrent, a wet, muddy, inconvenient hug of defense. But once it freezes, now it's just a decorative skating rink with excellent siege access. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough. Northern Europe in particular had a few famously bitter winters, especially during the so-called Little Ice Age, roughly 1300 to 1850, a period of irregular but often intense cold snaps. Castles in places like Burgundy, Flanders, and the northern Holy Roman Empire regularly saw their moats freeze solid during the worst of it. And while we might imagine this event triggering a dramatic panic, alarmed scrambling guards, a flurry of armor and urgency, the truth was usually quieter, less Hollywood, more awkward slipperiness, and someone saying, well, that's not ideal. At first, no one wants to admit it's frozen. The moat steams less, but that could just be morning chill. Someone throws a stick across it and says, still mushy. A goose walks across and doesn't fall in. That's when you really know. Because geese don't care about engineering, they just know when it's time to waddle to danger. You're the castle steward maybe, or just someone who knows better than to trust quiet water, and your job tonight is to assess the damage, or rather the unhelpful stability. The drawbridge creaks as it lowers, and the air smells like frozen mud, chimney smoke, and the faint tang of onion stew from the kitchens. Now, contrary to popular imagination, not every moat was full of snapping crocodiles or secret underwater tunnels. Most were stagnant, muddy ditches with questionable plumbing and a high risk of frogs. Some were even dry, more symbolic than functional, especially in later centuries. But a good water-filled moat, that was premium defense, especially if it stayed wet. Which is why freezing was such a problem. Once solid moats offered the enemy a lovely flat surface to march across. No boats needed, no bridge building. Just slap on some fur-lined boots and walk to war. Of course, that also meant the defenders had to prepare in new ways. Historians still argue whether most medieval castles had real emergency plans for frozen moats, or if they mostly hoped the weather would stay confusing. Some chronicles mention torch brigades or cauldrons of hot sand, but others suggest defenders just leaned on good old-fashioned stubbornness and prayed it would melt soon. Let's not forget that the very existence of a frozen moat also messed with internal castle life. Water sources could freeze, horses slipped, swans, if you were fancy enough to have them, got moody. One unlucky lord is said to have skated across his own moat as a joke, only to fall through and get stuck in the mud beneath the ice. His dignity was fished out later by two very unimpressed squires. But back to you. You're walking the perimeter now, testing the ice with a long pole. There's a soft crunch underfoot, and your breath curls in front of you like lazy smoke. A small boy with a stick trails behind you, pretending to be a knight, and you try not to trip over him. One of the guards leans down, touches the surface, and mutters something about goose-fat boots. And here's the thing. Freezing isn't always bad. In some cases, if you controlled the castle and didn't expect visitors of the siege variety, a frozen moat became, well, not helpful, but manageable. Easier to fetch water from the middle, Good for dumping waste farther out. Someone even tried ice fishing once. Didn't go well, but it was creative. Every region handled things differently. In some Italian city-states, moats were more ornamental than defensive, so a bit of ice just made for pretty reflections. But in frostier regions, it could be a serious concern. Some lords even commissioned rudimentary moat heaters, usually braziers or fires set along the banks to encourage melting. This worked about as well as you'd expect patchily, and with occasional fires breaking out in places not meant to burn. Still, the bigger concern wasn't just people crossing the moat. It was the message it sent that nature was in charge, that even stone walls and careful plans could be undermined by a few nights of sharp cold and heavy sky. And in a world where symbolism mattered almost as much as function, that could rattle confidence more than an invading army. So you keep walking one slow step at a time, your boots crunching over snow-dusted stone. The sky above you is a pale, unfriendly blue. Somewhere a bell rings, not an alarm just to mark the hour. And you know the day ahead will be filled with questions. Do we warn the villagers? Can we salt it without poisoning the ducks? Does the moat wizard know any defrosting spells? You make a note to cancel the morning joust. No one needs a lance-related concussion on ice. The next morning brings no thaw, just a crustier version of the same problem. The moat, now gleaming under a thin veil of frost, looks less like a defense feature and more like a badly placed ice rink no one asked for. The kitchen boy has already slipped on the stable stones and dropped a basket of onions. Again. That's twice this week, and while no one's tallying, you're fairly certain the local mice are. You trudge toward the guard tower with a cup of something warm barely clutched between your mittened hands. It might be mead or thin porridge or a failed herbal remedy from the cook. You sip it anyway because it's warm and it's yours, and there are no rules anymore, not when the moat has turned to crystal. As steward, you're expected to have some sort of plan. Not necessarily a good plan, just a plan. And the freezing moat has complicated that. You stare out over the battlements, watching as a pair of ducks argue on the icy surface, their feet slipping as they try to maintain dignity. It doesn't work. One falls honks in outrage and slides about 10 feet backward before giving up completely. You consider how moats were often designed not just to keep enemies out, but to mess with their sense of progress. The deeper and wider the moat, the more time it bought you. Some castles even filled their moats with bramble stakes, or if they were particularly paranoid eels. Not dangerous ones, just wriggly, unsettling. Imagine being an invading foot soldier marching across slush only to be distracted by a handful of eels with nowhere to go. It wouldn't stop you, but you'd definitely complain about it. Now, of course, the eels are probably frozen solid or hiding beneath whatever ice caves nature has carved for them overnight. And you're stuck thinking about how to deter people when the very deterrent has betrayed you by becoming helpful. Historians still argue whether medieval castle builders anticipated such events if moats were ever truly considered winterproof. Some suggest that castle walls were meant to be intimidating enough on their own, while the moat was just a bonus. Others claim that frozen moats were sometimes factored in, and inner defenses, murder holes, portcullises, and steep, narrow stairways were expected to pick up the slack during the colder months. Still, it doesn't sit right. You turn to Sir Rule, a knight of questionable rank and even more questionable mustache length, who's watching the ice and chewing what might be last night's mutton. Could we salt it, you ask? He shrugs. Only if you want to pay the monks extra. Salt's their jurisdiction. You do not want to pay the monks extra. The last time you did, they delivered a crate of something that was definitely not salt and possibly not even legal in this kingdom. It hissed. So instead, you suggest something unorthodox: distractions, diversions, the medieval version of stage magic, and by that, of course, you mean rumors. The first one you let loose is subtle, that the moat is haunted and only fools would cross it after dark. Within hours, the castle gossip circuit has inflated this into something far more elaborate, glowing geese, ghostly ice swans, and the spectral outline of a jester who drowned last Candlemas and now demands jokes as tribute. No one wants to be the first to test whether that's true, which is ideal. Later in the courtyard, you overhear a kitchen maid explaining to a visiting friar that if you speak the name of your worst fear into the moat's reflection, the moat will whisper it back twice and in Latin. You nod approvingly. That wasn't even your idea. Organic fear-mongering. Very efficient. There's also some logistical shuffling. Patrols are doubled at the outer walls. You convince a handful of guards to wear their shiniest armor and walk slow laps near the drawbridge as if they're expecting an inspection. Meanwhile, the local blacksmith, who doesn't really like being indoors, is tasked with hammering loudly near the front gate. It's not subtle, but it sounds like vigilance, which is often enough. Inside, life continues, albeit with extra layers and fewer illusions. You learn that it's harder to maintain authority when your cloak freezes mid-sway, giving you the stiffness of a wooden puppet. A pageboy lights every torch in the hallway just to warm his hands. Someone builds a miniature castle out of frozen bread crusts in the pantry. It's surprisingly detailed. And still the ice doesn't crack. It stays. It thickens. At one point, someone suggests using the frozen moat for recreation. Skating, maybe. A winter festival. You squash the idea immediately, not because you're against joy, but because the last thing you need is someone inviting the neighboring barons for a friendly ice jousting competition. You can practically hear the diplomatic disaster already. Baron Ludwig was felled not by your steel, but by your slippery moat. This means war. There's precedent for winter festivals turning sour. In 1281, during one bitterly cold December in Bohemia, a lord attempted to host a frost fair atop his moat. The ice held for the better part of an afternoon. Then, mid-merriment, a family of jugglers broke through near the west tower. No fatalities, just soggy tights, and a lifelong distrust of winter acrobatics. Still, the tale lived on. Your current plan, if it could be called that, is mostly about waiting, watching, hoping for a warm spell. You've tried poking the ice with poles, tossing hot ashes. A team even stomped in unison for an hour, hoping for rhythmic melting. That last one just made a rhythmic echo and drew more ducks. You pause near the chapel later that evening. Candles flicker inside, casting faint shapes across the snow-covered stones. You find yourself thinking about how much of medieval castle life wasn't about grand gestures or heroic defenses, but about managing small, consistent problems. Frozen wells, missing chickens, food shortages, and yes, icy moats. Because when the enemy might come, but the frost definitely has, you focus on the frost. It's less glamorous, but far more immediate. And it teaches you something funny, that survival, especially in winter, depends not on swords and bravado, but on who remembered to store dry firewood, who kept the morale steady, and who could convince a bored population that haunted ice was more terrifying than whatever might be crossing it. By the third day of frost, you've stopped pretending it might thaw on its own. The sun shows up, sure, but it barely puts in the effort. More of a cameo than a presence. It glances off the frozen moat like a candle off glass, pretty but useless. Even the ducks have moved on. They left around dawn in a huff, flapping off toward whatever pond hasn't betrayed them yet. You stand at the gatehouse now, sipping something that claims to be broth, but tastes like bark boiled with apology. It's fine. The castle steward doesn't get luxury, just vaguely warm liquids, and the satisfaction of not being personally responsible for structural collapse. Speaking of which, the carpenter has started eyeing the footbridge with concern. Not because it's damaged, but because someone, probably Sir Ruligan, has been using it to launch turnips onto the ice, attempting to test load-bearing qualities. You told him to stop. He told you it was science. He also tried to add defensive turnip lobbing to the roster of castle drills. You declined. Still, the fact remains, if the moat stays frozen, it becomes a walkway. And if it becomes a walkway, you lose the entire point of your watery inconvenience. So it's time to escalate subtly. You arrange for the castle musicians to practice outside near the moat, not for morale, not for entertainment, but because one of them plays a lute so shrill it could melt ice through sheer tonal aggression. You don't say that's the goal, but you hint, loudly. The performance draws a small crowd. Someone brings spiced wine. For a moment it feels like a festival again until the minstrel's string snaps and hits a nobleman in the eye. So much for music diplomacy. Inside, however, things are getting curious. One of the scullery maids swears she saw a fish swimming just beneath the ice. Not unusual, you think, until she adds that the fish had a ribbon tied around it, red, she says, and with a tiny bell. You stare at her waiting for a punchline. There isn't one, just the quiet confidence of someone who spent too much time near enchanted wells and seasonal mold. Historians still argue whether medieval folks truly believed in omens. Like that tiny symbolic fish bells in unexpected places, odd animals in seasonal distress. Some argue that much of it was metaphor, a poetic way of describing real-world phenomena. Others insist that superstition was the glue that held together medieval uncertainty. When your only map is the stars and your only thermometer is your bones, you get creative. You don't see the ribboned fish yourself, but you do begin noticing other small oddities. The moat, for instance, now has a faint sound to it, not cracking or creaking, but humming. You lean in one morning half asleep and swear it sounds like Gregorian chant filtered through reeds and regret. Of course, it's probably wind, or tinnitus, or the carpenter singing under his breath. But that doesn't stop the rumor from taking hold. The moat is now blessed, which means it's definitely not to be walked on because to do so would be sacrilegious. This is useful. You let it spread. You also begin reassigning patrols quietly. Guards previously stationed at the edge of the moat now rotate indoors. More eyes on the corridors, more ears near the kitchens. Because if someone does test the ice, you want to know before they go gliding off into history as the first man to siege a castle while skating. There's precedence for cold season invasions. During the 13th century, Scandinavian warriors occasionally traveled across frozen rivers to attack unsuspecting settlements. One notable case involved a band of raiders crossing a lake during a particularly brutal winter, only to find their target had already fled, leaving behind nothing but frozen stew and an apologetic note. It was reportedly a very awkward pillaging. Still, your concern is less about raiders and more about curiosity. Locals, children, ambitious goats, because once something looks safe, someone will test it. That's the way of all moats and all winters. So you step things up again. This time theatrics. The castle jester who once trained as a minor illusionist before realizing people would rather watch him fall down is enlisted for a new job. Every morning he walks solemnly to the edge of the moat and bows, just bows, says nothing, then walks away. People notice. They start whispering that he's paying respects to what no one knows, which makes it even better. Meanwhile, you've started storing large, heavy baskets near the entryway. Not because you need them, but because they look like ballast, like someone is planning for weight. You let a few servants ask questions, then you hush them mysteriously. You've seen how gossip works. Sometimes silence is more effective than orders. And sure enough, the mood changes. The frozen moat becomes something revered, feared, and finally respected. Children stop throwing pebbles. Teenagers stop daring each other to run across. The carpenter stops yelling for science before flinging root vegetables. Even Sir Rule starts walking around it rather than along it, muttering something about bad juju and frostbite. There's comfort in the absurd routines you've developed. You walk the same path each morning, touch the same stone archway for luck, murmur the same joke to the stable boy who pretends not to laugh. The absurdity becomes the rhythm. And in a frozen world where everything creaks and echoes, rhythm is half the battle. You notice, too, how much quieter the nights have become. Snow absorbs sound in a way nothing else can. Conversations turn to murmurs. Spoons click softly in pewter bowls. Fires are stoked more out of habit than need. The whole castle feels like it's holding its breath. You wonder occasionally if the moat will ever thaw, if spring will come, or if this year has decided to simply stop where it is mid-winter, mid-thought, mid-sentence. But then you remember moats freeze. People adapt. Sometimes with fish stories, sometimes with haunted rumors, sometimes with turnips launched in the name of science. Either way, the castle holds. By the fourth week, you've developed a deep and possibly inappropriate emotional connection with the moat. You greet it in the morning like a colleague. You nod at it during lunch. Sometimes, if no one's around, you speak to it under your breath just to see if it answers. It never does, of course, which is probably for the best. A talking moat would come with paperwork, but you can't help thinking it feels different now. Less like a barrier, more like a guest who's overstayed their welcome. The kind who drinks all the good wine, leaves hair in the basin, and won't take a hint. You try to keep spirits up. You institute Moat Awareness Week, complete with themed porridge and a short musical number by the cook's nephew who owns one drum and two confident opinions. The joke wears thin by the third day, but no one says anything, because acknowledging the silence around the moat makes it worse. Historically speaking, frozen moats weren't as rare as romanticized paintings suggest. In colder climates, particularly northern Europe, moats would freeze regularly during harsh winters. Castles in the Low Countries, for example, often had to reinforce outer gates or station additional guards during winter, knowing full well that a frozen defensive feature was just an accidental bridge waiting to happen. The smarter lords stocked up on boiling oil, not to pour, but to create slick patches, crude, dangerous, and thoroughly medieval. You briefly consider doing the same until you remember that oil is expensive and your guards are clumsy. The last thing you need is an unintended reenactment of Stuart slips into oblivion. Instead, you focus on diversion. You encourage indoor games, chastise the noble pastime of inventing new saints. This last one becomes oddly popular. By midweek, there are shrines to Saint Belinda of Soggy Boots and Saint Jeremy the Perpetually Lost. A bard writes a ballad about Saint Murgatroyd of the Frozen Bucket, whose miracle involved slipping, flailing, and inventing new profanity in 3 dialects before landing upright with the bucket still full. Miraculous indeed. You keep yourself busy with inventory. There's always something to count: firewood, salt, arguments over which barrels contain wine and which are just decorative. The quartermaster claims some of the dried eels have achieved sentience. You make a note to ignore that for a while. But even with distractions, the moat remains the castle's centerpiece, its shimmering, silent conversation starter. You try to keep track of who's watching it, not because you expect anything, but because people tend to stare at things they don't understand. And right now, the moat is doing an excellent impression of a mysterious oracle. There's that one scribe, for instance, Alaric with the eyebrows. He's taken to sketching the moat at different times of day, light studies, he says, though you suspect he's secretly hoping for a vision. Then there's Lady Agnes, who walks the perimeter daily murmuring something about patterns in the frost. You let her be. She once won an argument with the bishop using only a loaf of rye and a death stare. The local priest, however, is less amused. He declares the moat a seasonal temptation and insists on a small procession to bless it with holy water. You nod diplomatically, then quietly replace the water with weak ale. No one notices. Everyone pretends to feel better. That's diplomacy. Historians still argue whether medieval clergy genuinely believed in the sanctity of holy water as a protective measure against natural elements, or whether it was more about giving people the sense that something, anything, was being done. One fringe theory even suggests some monks created minor rituals specifically to address weather-based inconveniences, chants for hail prayers for fog, and a curious Albanian verse supposedly meant to discourage ice from forming near outhouses. You think about writing your own verse, something short, catchy, moat-focused, maybe a haiku. Frozen moat be gone. We liked you for 3 whole days. Now you're just a risk. Not bad. By now the ice has thickened to the point that it groans softly at night, long echoing sighs that vibrate through the stones. The guards claim they're used to it. The kitchen boy is not. He insists the moat is singing. You raise an eyebrow, like a hymn. He shakes his head. More like a disappointed goose, disappointed geese, or something you're well familiar with. The weather hasn't let up. Snow falls gently most mornings, turning everything a shade of pale hush. The moat wears a fine dusting like powdered sugar over a stale cake. The temptation to walk across it becomes a game of chicken among the younger lads. You catch them eyeing it, feet twitching. So you start assigning extra chores to anyone loitering too long by the water. The castle suddenly becomes extremely clean. You also put the blacksmith to work crafting a new kind of polearm, not for war, but for fishing out fools who fall through. The dunce hook, he calls it. You add a bell to the handle for flair, practical and humiliating. One evening, someone actually tries it. Not a person, thank heavens, but a sheep. Escaped from the pen and drawn by some unknowable ovine instinct, it clambers onto the ice with all the grace of a sack of damp laundry. Half the castle watches in horror. The other half watches in quiet curiosity, as if wondering if the sheep has a plan. It doesn't. It slips. It slides. It bleats in what might be Latin. You'll never know, because Sir Rule Ever the hero charges out with a blanket and a rope, yelling something about beasts of burden and bravery. He slips halfway through the rescue. The sheep ends up dragging him to safety. You call it a win. After that, the moat earns a new nickname, the sheep stage. Performers are discouraged, but rumors flourish. Someone swears the sheep winked. Another says they heard music again, this time in triple meter. One person claims the ice whispered their name. You tell them to take a nap. But the ice holds. And that's the real miracle, isn't it? Not that it sings or winks or glows under moonlight, but that it endures, quiet, cold, utterly disinterested in your drama. The moat is patient, and patience is its own kind of threat. You adjust your routines again. Less time watching, more time pretending not to. You read old scrolls. You polish lanterns. You spend a suspiciously long time trying to identify an unfamiliar herb in the stew. Spoiler, it's time. Always time. And each evening, as the castle settles into its usual nocturnal hush, you walk the ramparts and glance down at the frozen mirror below. Still intact. Still waiting. Still quietly judging. By now, you've started dreaming about it. Not every night, but often enough that the frozen moat has taken up residence somewhere between your subconscious and your spleen. Sometimes in your dreams, it's just ice, crisp, quiet, lightly cracked like old porcelain. Other times it opens like a mouth or a scroll, or worse, a door. You do your best not to overthink this. It's probably just winter fatigue, that or the stew again. You've asked the cook to stop experimenting with root surprise. You don't like surprises, especially when they involve tubers. You're not alone, though. Others have started acting moat adjacent. The steward says he dreamt of falling through the ice, only to find a fully furnished parlor underneath. Someone else claims they woke up humming a tune they'd never heard before, then realized it matched the sound of the ice cracking at sunrise. Sleepwalking incidents go up. No one gets hurt, thankfully, except a stable boy who tried to skate in his boots and promptly invented a new way to bruise his dignity. Still, the mood has shifted. Historians still argue whether prolonged exposure to specific medieval landscapes, frozen lakes, whispering woods, or even old battlements affected local folklore more than actual events. One theory suggests that entire myth cycles sprang not from what happened in a place, but from what people felt when nothing did. A still moat, a quiet winter, a few too many echoing footsteps. These were the raw ingredients of legends. Add a long night and a little fear-instant story. And so a story begins to form. You hear the whispers during meals in corners by hearths. The moat knows. The ice remembers. Sir Giles swore it winked at him. Sir Giles is not the most reliable narrator. He once mistook a weasel for a bishop. Still, you make note of these tales half in amusement, half just in case. A good lord keeps track of gossip. It's like bookkeeping, but with more goats and fewer numbers. Now, back to the ice. There comes a point, perhaps week 5, perhaps week 6, when the frozen moat becomes not a novelty, not even a nuisance, but simply a fact. Like gravity or soup, it's there and everyone adjusts. Trade slows. Messengers arrive slower than usual, their boots thick with mud and snow. The road to the next village is passable barely. You decide against sending more patrols. If anything needs attention, it'll have to yell louder. Daily tasks have been rerouted around the ice, buckets lowered with longer ropes, snow shoveling teams allocated to make safe anti-skid paths between towers. A surprising number of people volunteer for tower duty. You realize it offers the only elevated view of the entire icy stretch. There's something both thrilling and unnerving about watching it from above, like peering into the mind of a very cold poet. The carpenter takes initiative and builds a small wooden bridge just 2 planks wide, leading from one end of the inner courtyard over a particularly narrow section of moat. It's not meant for daily use, it's ceremonial, a joke, a charm. He paints a tiny goat at the center. No one comments, but everyone nods. One of the pages starts composing riddles about the moat. They're not very good, but you pretend they are, because that's leadership. Riddle me this, I am still but not dead. I reflect but don't reply. Cross me not unless you fly. What am I? Answer the moat, or possibly the steward on Wednesdays. You install a bell in the watchtower, not for alarm, but for vibes. One soft chime at sunrise, one at dusk. It gives the day a rhythm, the kind of rhythm winter often steals. And then something strange happens. It begins to thaw. Not all at once. Just a whisper of change, a darker shade here, a soft trickle near the edge, a shift in the echo when you toss a pebble. It's the kind of thing only noticed by those who've been watching too long, which by now is everyone. The news spreads like dry parchment catching a spark. The ice is changing. The moat stirs. Nature reclaims her teeth. That last one is from Alaric. He's been reading poetry again. People gather at the edge, slowly, respectfully, like mourners. You allow it. It feels right. A guard suggests testing the ice. You say no, not yet. Give it a day, or 3. Let the moat have its farewell. No sense rushing the inevitable. The moat, after all, is in charge. You host a small supper. Nothing fancy, just root vegetables, flatbread, a little mead. A winter's end sort of thing. Midway through, someone proposes a toast. To the moat, our coldest neighbor. Glasses clink. Someone hums, possibly the same tune from earlier. A passing snowstorm interrupts, flinging flakes like disapproving confetti. The fire crackles louder, defiant. You drink slowly, watching the window. The ice will break soon. The next morning, you're awake before the bell. The moat is still, but lighter somehow, thinner. And then just after the sunrise chime, it happens. A soft, delicate crack, barely audible. Like a whisper with a splinter, the crowd gasps and then laughs. A strange, nervous laugh, like they've been let out of a long, cold sermon. You smile. The moat is waking up. You order a final watch rotation, 2 guards just to observe, nothing more. No need to prod or test. Let nature do what nature does. And for the first time in nearly 2 months, you walk away from the moat without glancing back. Not because it doesn't matter anymore, but because finally it no longer owns the moment. The spell is breaking. The winter recedes, and in its place puddles mud and mildly disappointing birdsong. Which is to say, spring is arriving. The puddles come first, then the smell. You wouldn't think a thawing moat would be particularly fragrant, and you'd be correct. The scent is not memorable in a good way, but it's certainly memorable. A tangy, earthy mix of wet stones, rotting leaves, last autumn's mistakes, and maybe a whisper of frog. It's like the moat is exhaling after holding its breath all season, and the breath is not minty fresh. But it's alive again. That's what matters. You hear the first plop of water returning to its proper liquidity while leaning against the west wall, chewing something vaguely turnip-like. It's a good plop, solid, unambiguous, the kind of plop that says, "I'm back, baby." Within a day, the ice is gone from the shallows and the surface shivers with movement. Not full waves, not yet, but a shimmer like someone stirred the surface with a very large ladle. You nod approvingly, even though no one is watching. Guards who'd spent weeks watching for cracks now check for logs, debris, floating boots. They find a surprisingly intact wooden spoon and treat it like a relic. One carves a tiny goat on the handle, because of course. You know things are back to normal when the rats return to their preferred bridge routes. No more ice highways for them. Now they scurry like proper medieval rats, furtive, damp, and mildly judgmental. The carpenter quietly removes his ceremonial bridge. He doesn't say anything, just gives the painted goat a small nod and hauls the planks back to his shed. That's closure medieval style. With the moat back to its cold, murky self, castle life rebalances. Supply wagons can roll in again slowly thanks to the mud, and your stores are replenished with all the exciting basics, barley beans, and something labeled meatish. You don't ask. The steward drafts a cheerful memo for the castle staff. Normal moat conditions restored. Ice patrols disbanded. Please return to your usual levels of vigilance and despair. It's posted by the main stairwell. Gets a few chuckles. A few sighs. There's even talk of a feast. A small one. Nothing extravagant. Just a, we survived winter and so did the water feature sort of deal. The cook agrees, but only if she can serve her famous pottage with mystery garnish. You say fine, as long as the mystery is less mysterious than last time. At the feast, someone recites a poem about the frozen moat. It's not good, but it rhymes and it's short. People applaud anyway. The conversation drifts, as it always does, from food to weather to goats. Yes, the goat theme lingers like an inside joke no one started, but everyone now maintains. Someone claims the moat sang once on the coldest night. Someone else insists it was just the wind. A third suggests it was the wind in a goat-shaped mood. Historians still argue whether the enduring nature of these little winter legends reflects a communal need for narrative or simply boredom dressed up as belief. When the world slows down, you start noticing things you'd usually ignore. Creaking wood, long shadows your own thoughts. Especially that last one, unsettling business that. By mid-spring, the moat is nearly cheerful. Ducks arrive. Frogs start their midnight meetings. A boy gets dared to swim across it and wisely declines. A girl does it anyway, fully clothed, then walks back into the hall as if nothing happened. You make a mental note to promote her one day. The thaw also reveals what winter hid. You rediscover the broken fence near the herb garden, a mislaid sword in the snow, and the fact that you're now, according to one list, 3 candles short of being fully illuminated. The candle steward is offended. You let it slide. And one morning, just as you're adjusting to the gentle normalcy of it all, someone knocks on your chamber door with an update you didn't expect. A visitor. Not just any visitor, someone claiming to be a moat watcher from the east. Not an official title, clearly, more of a self-appointed hobbyist. He carries a satchel full of scrolls, 3 jars of what he calls thaw samples, and a disturbingly intimate knowledge of local amphibians. He speaks quickly, fondly, like someone describing a pet swamp. He's been observing thaw patterns in castle moats for years and is writing a treatise on the sentient qualities of defensive water. You resist the urge to smile, barely. You grant him 3 days access on the condition that he doesn't feed the frogs or talk to the moat aloud after dark. He agrees, though you catch him whispering once. You decide to pretend you didn't. On the second night, he shares a theory that certain moats act as emotional sponges, absorbing the fears, hopes, and seasonal melancholy of those living near them. He says your moat is particularly receptive, possibly moody, maybe even a little flirtatious. You decide he should leave a day early. Still, the idea sticks with you. That water might remember things, that ice might carry dreams, that stillness isn't always emptiness. You watch the moon reflected in the now liquid moat and wonder how many winters it has seen, how many lords and ladies have looked into it and felt watched back. Probably a lot, probably none. That's the magic of maybes. There's no final moment to mark the end of the frozen season, no ceremony, no ribbon cutting or official splash. It just stops being a problem, like a cold that fades without you noticing, like a sigh that dissolves into regular breathing. And so you return to the ordinary complications of medieval castle life: taxes, leaks, minor uprisings, chickens who think they're cats. You nod at the moat occasionally, just in case it's paying attention. You don't fear the next winter, but you respect it. The moat taught you that. Now it's time to rest. Let the ducks squabble. Let the frogs sing. Let the water be water again. Close your eyes. Breathe in the cool spring air, and remember, even the coldest winters end. Even the moat lets go. Now let yourself drift. The castle quiets. The fire dims. Somewhere below, a stream chuckles softly to itself, perhaps remembering a dream, or maybe just warming its way back to life. The walls no longer creak with frost, and the air smells not of fear or ice, but of moss and old stories. You've made it through the stillness. The moat has thawed. Your breath slows. The shadows lengthen not as threats, but as blankets. Nothing presses, nothing pulls. The night holds you without asking questions. All is quiet. All is soft. You're wrapped in a heavy wool blanket inside a drafty wooden hut in the Alps sometime in the late 1300s. The shutters rattle a bit in the wind. The fire in the hearth is a slow, smoldering orange glow, and your straw mattress, generous by medieval standards, smells vaguely like goat, or possibly cabbage. You've stopped asking. But something's wrong. You can feel it in your bones, or maybe just in your neck. Your host, a stooped farmer with one eyebrow and 5 opinions, insisted you position your bed along the north wall, head facing north, feet due south, not the other way around, not ever. You probably won't survive this if you're the kind of person who questions local customs to their faces. Best to just smile, nod, and agree that yes, clearly sleeping with your head facing south would lead to certain doom. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is over there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wind outside howls like it's making a point. A loose shutter claps once against the side of the hut, and you instinctively pull the blanket tighter. You're in a highland village, one of those tiny, stubborn clusters of homes stitched together with frozen mud and necessity. Everything smells faintly of wood smoke, animal hair, and overcooked parsnips. Inside the room is quiet except for the old man's occasional snores and the faint whistle of wind sneaking under the door. You shift slightly on your straw mattress, wondering if your toes are colder than your nose or if it's the other way around. And then you remember you're facing north. Good. That's the way it's done here. It's not a matter of comfort, really, or feng shui. This is the Alps after all. Comfort is a luxury reserved for springtime. No, this is about something older, stranger, a belief that's woven into the thatched rooftops and mossy stones of the region that if you sleep with your head facing south, something bad will happen. Not immediately. That would be too obvious, but slowly, quietly, the kind of bad luck that unrolls itself over time like a crooked tapestry. Nobody agrees on why. Some say the southern wind carries sickness. Others mutter that the mountains don't like being pointed at in your sleep. A few, particularly animated villagers, claim that the souls of the dead drift north to south, and lying the wrong way might confuse them. No one wants to be woken up by a confused ghost. Historians still argue whether this belief began with folklore, religious taboos, or simple cold logic. Maybe it was all three stitched together by centuries of trial, error, and uneasy naps. What we do know is that it was surprisingly widespread, especially in alpine regions. From parts of Switzerland to rural Tyrol, even into southern Germany, tales abounded about the dangers of facing the wrong way during rest. One local saying, now mostly forgotten, went something like north for the living, south for the soil. It's poetic, which is often a red flag for folklore pretending to be fact. Of course, there were practical reasons too. In many traditional alpine homes, beds were placed against the north-facing walls because they were the most structurally insulated. Southern walls, with their sun-facing windows and drafty cracks, were considered less secure. Sleeping with your head near the coldest window, not ideal when the average winter night could freeze your beard to your chest. Still, that explanation doesn't account for the layers of myth that piled onto the belief. One 14th century diary scribbled in the margin of a farm ledger no less casually noted that a villager who slept south-facing for 3 nights woke up with blunted memory and poor singing. No follow-up, no proof, just a footnote of doom. You pull the blanket up over your ears, trying to forget that your feet are now technically pointed toward danger. It's fine. You're not superstitious, just respectful. Respectful of things like wind patterns, local spirits, and the very specific way your host looked at you when you almost rotated your bed. There's a kind of sleepy logic to it, though. When you live in a place where the world can bury your home in snow overnight, where avalanches can rearrange a mountainside in minutes, and where the line between comfort and calamity is measured in goose fat and good luck charms, it makes sense that direction matters. That sleeping is more than just lying still. That maybe the orientation of your dreams could influence the shape of your day. As you drift closer to sleep, the idea starts to make a strange sort of sense. Maybe facing north really does align you with some ancient current of safety. Maybe the cold knows which direction you're pointed and punishes accordingly. Or maybe the old man's terrifyingly large dog just doesn't like people pointing their heads toward his food bowl. Either way, you let your thoughts settle into the straw. You breathe in slowly. The air smells like damp wood and faint cabbage. And despite the wind, despite the cold, and despite the ominous superstition surrounding sleep geometry, you feel almost cozy. Almost. By morning, your neck feels fine, but you don't mention that to anyone. You just nod sagely when your host asks how you slept, mumble something about vivid dreams, and resist the urge to flip your bedding just to see what happens. There's a superstition tax in these parts, and payment is often exacted in stares. Breakfast is grayish, possibly porridge, possibly rehydrated bread. Either way, it's warm, and that's all that matters. A nearby fire crackles in a hearth made from cracked stones and blackened iron, and you sip a wooden cup of something that tastes like weak herbs boiled in regret. Still, it warms your hands, and the morning silence is thick enough to lean on. Your host points a gnarled finger toward the south-facing slope. "See that hill," he says. "Never sleep pointed at it, not since the frost took the sheep." He doesn't explain what that means. You don't ask. The frost here is treated like a semi-retired monster, mostly quiet but capable of terrible things when provoked. It's here, amid morning gruel and ambiguous sheep folklore, that you start to wonder where this directional dread really comes from. Because let's be honest, north, south, east, west, none of them actually do anything to you while you sleep. Or, do they? One theory, at least, from the more scholarly corners of the medieval world, which is to say, monks with too much parchment proposed that certain wind directions were tied to divine will. The south wind, in particular, was occasionally blamed for madness, illness, and dreams of inopportune character, which sounds like the medieval version of blaming your horoscope for texting your ex. Historians still argue whether this belief was based on climate patterns or theological speculation. Was the southern wind feared because it was warmer, damper, and carried more disease? Or because it was associated with moral decay coming up from the so-called lands of temptation? Southern Europe, land of wine olives and poorly behaved troubadours, was always slightly suspect. In the Alps, where every breeze feels like a personal affront, it's not surprising that wind got blamed for a lot. Cold wind makes people cranky. Cranky people invent rules, and rules over time turn into rituals. So it starts as don't sleep near the draft becomes never sleep facing south, or the marmots will steal your luck. And yes, that's a real belief in at least one alpine folktale, though luck-stealing marmots may be a regional exaggeration. Still, you're not ruling anything out. The villagers around here treat marmots like furry weather deities, small, squat, and not to be trifled with. If a marmot circles your home clockwise before sunrise, that's good luck. Counterclockwise, immediate oat shortages, or maybe gout. You leave the hut later that day, stretching your back and admiring the thick muffled snow that blankets the ground. The path through the village is narrow and packed firm by generations of trudging boots. Icicles dangle like glass fangs from every roof, and even the chickens wear expressions of mild judgment. As you pass by a small chapel half buried in snow, its bell frozen into silence, you notice something odd. All the graves in the churchyard are aligned the same way, headstones facing west, feet pointed east, the opposite of what your host demanded. This, it turns out, is standard medieval practice. East was seen as the direction of the resurrection, where Christ would return, so the dead were buried facing eastward, ready to rise up and greet salvation face first. This alignment wasn't just symbolic, it was practical theology. You had to be lying correctly to qualify for a proper afterlife, like getting into heaven via correct postal code. So if the dead must face east and the living are warned not to sleep facing south, does that mean west and north are the only safe directions? Possibly. Or maybe it just proves that nobody really knew and everyone was hedging their bets in slightly different ways. Inside a nearby barn, a group of elderly women is drying herbs above the animals' pens. One of them, her fingers stained with something vaguely purple, tells you that her grandmother always slept with her head under a horseshoe and her feet pointing northeast. Keeps the night whispers out, she says, tapping her temple, and invites polite dreams, not the rude kind with bears. You thank her for this information. You don't ask follow-up questions. There's a tone people use when they're talking about dreams and bears, and it usually means the conversation is over. That night you return to the hut, wrap yourself in the same wool blanket, and once again align yourself with the wisdom of the north wall. You stare at the low ceiling beams for a while, listening to the wind clawing at the shutters. A goat coughs somewhere nearby, possibly in the same room. You close your eyes and picture an invisible compass floating above your chest. North to your head, south to your feet. You're aligned with safety, tradition, possibly with a line of monks snoring in unison across the continent. It's a strange comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. Because even if the belief doesn't make sense, it's clear that it matters. To these villagers, to their ancestors, to the marmots watching from the hillside with inscrutable judgment, it matters. And in a world filled with wolves, avalanches, and porridge that bites back sometimes, a silly rule is the only structure you get. A small ritual against chaos. A superstition-shaped shield made of direction and desire. You shift slightly in your straw bed, the scent of smoke and cabbage clinging to your blanket like a protective charm. Somewhere outside, snow begins to fall again. Quiet, slow, and soft enough to erase the shape of everything it touches. You exhale slowly and face the right way. You wake up without incident. No hauntings, no dream bears, no mysterious marmots perched on your chest whispering in dead languages. Just the usual creak of joints and the smell of someone unsuccessfully attempting to reheat cabbage. It's a good sign, or at least not a bad one. Your host hands you a crust of bread and gestures to the snowy path beyond the threshold. If you're walking to the next village, he says, mind the wind at the chapel bend. South turns funny there. Again, not a lot of explanation, just the vague sense that certain directions are trickier than others, and that the South is never just South. It's always the South with italics and a knowing look. As you trudge through the snow, your boots making those soft, deliberate crunches that only exist in the cold, you start to piece it together. Not just the superstition, but the emotional weather behind it. There's something about South that feels open, too vulnerable. In many medieval alpine villages, the southern slope was the one most exposed to storms, the one least sheltered by forest or cliff. It bore the brunt of warm winds from Italy, which could mean a sudden melt, a flash flood, or worse, a thaw, followed by a refreeze leaving behind ice slicks, crueler than any highway bandit. So the superstition wasn't just metaphysical, it was meteorological. Facing south while sleeping wasn't a cosmic error. It was asking to be flattened by the next avalanche, or to wake up to soggy wool and missing goats. This explains why so many older houses here face northward or eastward, even when it means giving up sun exposure. The idea was to keep your front door and your dreams away from the influence of southern skies. There's a kind of stubborn, weather-fearing logic to it. You don't tempt fate, and fate apparently hangs out in the south. Historians still argue whether this directional avoidance was consciously architectural, or simply the result of accumulated folk wisdom passed down through very pointed stares and muttered kitchen warnings. Either way, it stuck. At a rest stop along your snowy route, a sort of halfway hut that smells like cheese-damp wool, and regret you strike up a quiet chat with the keeper. She's boiling something in a pot that smells medicinal and slightly alarming. As you warm your fingers by the fire, she tells you about the south sleepers. They used to say she whispers that sleeping with your head to the south meant your soul might slip out the wrong way. She makes a small circular gesture above her head like someone opening a trap door. Hard to get back in after that. It's the kind of logic that only makes sense in a world where dreams are porous, and sleep is a journey, not a pause. In some folk traditions of the region, the soul was thought to drift upward or outward during slumber, free to roam to seek omens or just to go sightseeing in the local dreamscape, but only if it had a clear path home. Facing south might confuse it, or worse, invite it to keep going. You sip whatever she gives you in the mug. It tastes like boiled bark and politely concealed menace. Still, it warms your stomach. The idea of the soul wandering in sleep isn't unique to the Alps. Across medieval Europe and into the Middle East and parts of Asia, there were similar beliefs. In some Slavic folklore, a sleeping person's soul was accompanied by a small animal, a mouse, a bird, sometimes even a moth. If that creature was disturbed, the person might never wake up. In the Alps, the animal became less literal and more directional. Southward sleep-soul confusion, possibly spiritual detours, which brings us naturally to dream maps. Yes, medieval monks in a few mountain abbeys tried to create spiritual cartography. They drew speculative charts not just of heaven and hell, but of dream planes, invisible spaces that the sleeping spirit might wander. The south, you'll be entirely unsurprised to learn, was the most difficult terrain. Too warm, too shadowed, too indulgent. One abbot supposedly wrote in a letter that survives only in footnote form and occasional song. You pause under a snow-covered tree and consider that even dreams needed maps, that medieval people feared not just bad dreams, but bad directional dreams. The wrong sleep heading might send your soul into a swamp of temptation or get it caught in some celestial cul-de-sac. Meanwhile, the real world continues quietly. The trail ahead bends toward a wooden bridge spanning a frozen stream, and beyond it, another cluster of houses, each aligned in slightly different directions, as if no one quite agreed on where salvation actually lay. A passing shepherd greets you with a nod. His sheep, you notice, are wearing little bells and facing northwest, possibly coincidence, possibly coordinated resistance. You arrive at your destination by late afternoon, the sky already smudged with early twilight. The inn here is slightly larger than the last, its walls hung with dried herbs, and something suspiciously like garlic, though no one mentions vampires. They wouldn't. Vampires are an evening topic. That night, your bed is beside a window that points not quite directly but unmistakably toward the southern sky. You can see the stars glinting faintly through the frost-glazed pane. The innkeeper has no opinions about sleep directions, or perhaps she just assumes you already know the rules. You lie awake longer than usual, tracing invisible lines across the ceiling with your eyes wondering what kind of dreams belong to the south. Are they warmer? Wilder? Slightly judgmental? Is that where forgotten thoughts end up curling like fog in the corner of the room? Eventually, sleep takes you. You face south. Just for once. You dream, but you don't remember most of it, just snippets. A goat nodding solemnly, a bell that rings underwater, a shadow that hums a lullaby in Latin. Standard fare, really. When you wake, the room is filled with a pale glow. Morning in the Alps never arrives quickly. It sort of leaks in like tea through cloth. You stretch beneath a blanket that smells faintly of hay and soaproot and consider the fact that sleeping south didn't kill you. Encouraging. The innkeeper brings you a breakfast of hard cheese, toasted rye, and something that may once have been a pear. She gestures to a bench near the fire and says, "You're lucky. You faced south and woke up sane." Then she smiles. It's unclear whether she's joking. While you eat, an old man in the corner, wrapped in enough wool to pass for a walking mattress, tells a story about a boy who slept facing south and started speaking backward in his dreams. No one could understand him, but the cows liked it. They gave more milk when he whispered. Eventually, the villagers made him their honorary night watchman and built him a bed that rotated by season. You ask if it's true. He says yes, but then again he also claims to have fought a duel with a weather vane in 1289. You take it with a grain of salt, south-facing salt, obviously. The myths you realize are half comfort, half cautionary tale. They don't have to be true. They just have to be useful. A village that believes in dream directions is a village that checks its neighbors are warm, tucked in, and facing the right way. It's sleepy community building through superstition. You venture into town after breakfast. There's a market going on, bundled figures bartering dried mushrooms, carved combs, and suspicious jars of snow balm. It smells like beeswax and pine panic. No one is facing south. The stalls lean eastward, like they're all hoping for a little sun and fewer cursed dreams. In the center of the square, a carved post stands tall, painted with symbols: suns, moons, stars, and 4 crude arrows. It's a local directional marker used for festivals, marriages, and naturally burying spoons. The latter, you learn from a shopkeeper, is part of a midwinter tradition where people bury the year's tired utensils facing north to rest them for spring. You can't tell if he's making it up. Frankly, you don't want to know. There's a small chapel nearby its bell tower, slightly lopsided from years of snowdrift pressure. Inside, frescoes line the walls, some cracked and faded, others oddly vivid. One panel catches your eye, a group of sleepers, each curled beneath golden halos, their bodies aligned like compass needles. An angel hovers overhead, nudging one person gently with a scroll. The caption reads in Latin, "He who turns in sleep forgets his path," ambiguous, mysterious, entirely on brand. You sit on a pew for a while and wonder about the role of direction in belief. If east is sacred, north is steady, west is mysterious, and south is complicated, what does that say about the medieval mind? Or any mind, really? Historians still argue whether these beliefs were codified or cobbled together over centuries of anecdote and weather-based trauma. There are references to directional sleeping in 13th century health manuals, but also in tavern songs and marginalia doodles where south-facing beds are drawn with tiny devils tugging at the sheets. Not exactly peer-reviewed theology, but oddly persuasive. Back outside, a boy throws snowballs at a tree while reciting something that sounds like a spell. You ask what he's saying. He shrugs. Just keeping the birds polite. You decide not to sleep facing the tree either. That evening, the sky clears, revealing a stretch of constellations you can't quite name. The innkeeper, in a rare burst of exposition, tells you that each village here has its own bedtime rites. Some place a silver spoon at the windowsill. Others hum a single note before sleep to align the ears. One nearby hamlet insists on hanging a ribbon over the bed's headboard, blue for west, red for south, yellow for no preference, but still polite. You ask if anyone sleeps facing west. Only poets, she says, and goats who've given up. You wonder if that's the source of the fear deep down, that south is simply the direction of surrender. The warm wind, the soft pull, the letting go. In a world of survival and structure that can be unnerving. You lie in bed again, the wooden frame creaking with every twitch. You face east tonight, not out of fear necessarily, but because tradition is like a wool blanket, itchy but oddly reassuring. Somewhere outside, wind curls around the chimney and sighs like a tired historian. You picture that fresco again, those sleeping bodies like compass roses, a quiet geometry of belief. And you begin to see it for what it is, not a warning, but a wish. A way to draw order from a world that rarely offered it. Sleep, after all, is the only time you don't have to do anything, so why not shape it, direct it, protect it, even with something as simple as which way your toes point. You let your eyes close. This time you don't care which way you're facing. Not really. But just in case, you inch northward. You wake once more to the muffled quiet of a snow-covered village, the kind of stillness that makes you wonder if time itself has frozen slightly out of politeness. No rooster crows, no bells chime. Just the gentle tick of melting icicles and the shuffle of someone trying not to disturb the frost too much. By now you've traveled through 3 villages, shared soup with 5 different locals, and slept in 4 different bed orientations, including one night in a hayloft that faced all directions at once thanks to a rotting floorboard and a helpful chicken. And yet the question remains, what exactly made South so bothersome? One answer, of course, is fire. Not the burning kind, but the elemental one. In many medieval cosmologies, directions were linked to elements. East was air, the rising sun, breath beginnings. West was water endings, mystery buoy, and the occasional sea monster. North was earth, cold, stable, deeply inconvenient to plant anything in after October. And south was fire, passion, unpredictability, fever dreams, and not always in a good way. This belief filtered down into everything from herbal medicine to dream interpretation. A child who sleepwalked to the south end of the house was said to be spirit-stirred. Someone who regularly slept facing south might be declared dream-heavy, or worse, suffering from nocturnal tumult. It sounds dramatic, but it mostly just meant someone had vivid dreams and probably talked in their sleep. Historians still argue whether the elemental associations were widely known among common folk or just monkish nonsense whispered between sips of poorly made cider. But traces of the belief survive in regional lullabies, folk charms, even in travel prayers said before crossing southern passes. They all advise caution, clarity, and occasionally the consumption of garlic to anchor the spirit. Garlic anchors everything, apparently. By now, you've picked up the rhythm of things. You walk slowly, not because you're tired, but because the world demands it. The snow dictates the tempo. The cold humbles your ambition, and the hills remind you that paths don't need to be straight to be purposeful. You pass a shrine, not a grand one, just a carved stump with a tin bell and a tiny scrap of ribbon tied in a knot. Red, facing south, someone's quiet protest perhaps, or maybe their offering. There's one more legend you're told before you leave the region entirely. It comes from a hermit who lives just above the tree line, a man so bundled in furs he resembles a pile of forgotten rugs. He offers you a seat, some chamomile steeped in snowmelt, and says this: "They feared the south," he says, because it was the only direction the sun ever fully committed to. It rose in the east, dipped in the west, but in the south it stared, full and bright and hard, unblinking. The way truth does when you're not quite ready. You sit with that. Sip your tea, watch the wind blow past his cave like it's in a hurry to be mysterious elsewhere. South then becomes more than geography. It's the part of yourself you don't always want to face, the dreams you avoid, the possibilities that make you sweat even in snow. That night, for your final sleep in the Alps, you drag your cot to the very southernmost corner of the inn's upper room. The beams creak in warning. A candle flickers reluctantly nearby. You lie down facing full south. It feels like cheating a little bit, but also like a challenge accepted. Your dreams are strange. Something about goats in formal wear hosting a council of weather spirits. You can't recall if you voted. You wake up with the taste of juniper in your mouth and the certainty that somehow the wind has changed direction. Outside, the first real thaw has begun. A drip. Then another. Then 50 more, like a polite army of leaky roofs announcing the end of winter. You did it. You survived south. You slept into it, not away from it. And maybe that's the point, that sometimes the direction doesn't matter. What matters is how still you let yourself be while the world does its thing around you. It's almost enough to make you believe in sacred geometry. Almost. You pack your things, pull your cloak tight, and nod one last time to the southern sky. Still bright, still staring, still not blinking. The air smells faintly of rosewater and old ink, and the scholars are already deep in debate. Their robes rustle like dry leaves, scrolls unfurl with the precision of ritual, and you're late to the most underwhelming weather argument in history. Because tonight we're not pondering war or love or high drama. We're asking, what shape is a raindrop? You probably won't survive this, not from danger, but from sheer conceptual slipperiness. Because this is the kind of conversation where someone might use the phrase spherical humility in a serious tone and then spend the next hour arguing with a pigeon. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is over there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're seated now in a sun-dappled veranda just off a small domed library in Nishapur. The city is quietly bustling somewhere outside the walls, but in here the only sounds are the scrape of reeds on parchment and the occasional polite throat clearing. Around you, half a dozen scholars from various corners of the Abbasid world are trying to decide whether raindrops fall in perfect spheres, bulbous bulbs, or something else entirely. To be clear, none of these men has ever seen a raindrop mid-air in any detail. They've seen rain, of course, felt it, walked in it, thanked or cursed it, but high-speed cameras have not yet been invented, and it turns out rain is rather fast. So the primary tool of this conversation is not observation, but extrapolation, with occasional help from metaphysics. One scholar who insists on standing under the lemon tree for maximum enlightenment proposes that raindrops must be perfect spheres because the heavens are perfect and all things that fall from heaven inherit its geometry. He cites Aristotle and then leans smugly on a scroll so full of marginal notes it might be growing moss. Another counters that water cannot fall in perfect spheres because wind and gravity distort it. He's holding a spoon and gesturing with it, which feels suspiciously modern. He claims that water has no shape of its own, merely the shape it's given, like political consensus or jelly. The oldest of the group says nothing for several minutes, then murmurs, "And what of the teardrop, which derails the conversation for a full 20 minutes while everyone remembers sorrow loss, and that one time a pigeon got stuck in the madrasa's eaves?" Historians still argue whether these debates were truly widespread or merely the intellectual hobbies of well-funded daydreamers. But in Persia, under the patronage of the Buyid emirs, scholarly discussions like this were actually common. Sometimes the debates veered into practical science like optics or irrigation. Other times they stayed blissfully suspended in metaphor, gently resisting relevance. Your host, a young assistant whose job is to refill the ink pots and make sure the geometry tiles don't get stepped on, is trying not to fall asleep. He's heard this argument before. He once proposed that raindrops might fall shaped like lentils, which got him politely laughed at and assigned to firewood duty for a month. Tonight, though, things are unusually civil. There's no shouting, no ink flung across the courtyard in passive-aggressive curls. Just quiet disagreement and the occasional citation of obscure Greek fragments, preserved through Arabic translation and poetic footnote. You lean back against the wall, letting the low hum of contemplation wash over you. The air is warm but not oppressive. A dove coos on the lintel. Somewhere tea is being poured. And in this strange space between weather and wisdom, you begin to understand this isn't really about raindrops. It's about finding patterns where none are guaranteed, about insisting the universe might still be legible, even if only in moments, even if only in droplets. You blink slowly, watching a shaft of sunlight filter through the latticework. Dust dances, someone sneezes, and still the question hangs, is the sphere the truest shape of descent, or merely the most flattering? The scholar with the spoon has now taken to dripping water from a jug in carefully controlled trickles, trying to observe the moment the droplet breaks free. He declares that it flattens slightly before release, proving his point. Another scholar insists the drop returns to spherical form mid-fall like a noble soul correcting its posture. They agree to disagree and instead begin discussing the sound rain makes when it hits silk versus when it hits stone. You make a note never to ask them about snow. The session ends as the muezzin's call echoes across the city, soft and distant. Robes are adjusted, scrolls rolled, the spoon is reluctantly returned to the kitchen. And as you rise, stretching gently, you realize you've been thinking about rain differently. Not as a forecast, but as a question. A shape-shifting question with no urgent need for an answer. You step outside and the sky, as if on cue, offers a brief drizzle. You tilt your face upward, and for a moment you swear the drops are round. Or not. The rain doesn't last long, but it leaves behind a slick sheen on the stone steps, and a brief argument about whether wet sandals should be permitted in the central hall. You sidestep that particular dispute by pretending to study the wall carvings, which depict various natural phenomena, all rendered in a suspiciously spherical style. Tonight, the scholars are moving indoors. There's a chill in the air, and someone has brought honeyed dates in a worryingly smoky brazier. The question on the floor, raised, of course, by the scholar who brought the spoon yesterday, is not just what shape a raindrop is, but what shape it ought to be cosmologically speaking. This is not a joke. Well, it is, but not to them. According to a new theory floated by a visiting astronomer from Rei, raindrops are spheres until they pass through the fifth layer of atmosphere, at which point they become teardrop-shaped in mourning for their departure from the celestial realm. This is not entirely based on science, more on a poem he heard once. But the poem did rhyme, so here we are. You sip warm milk steeped with cardamom and blink slowly as they debate the theological implications of melancholy precipitation. One scholar insists this ties in with the story of the prophet Idris, who allegedly once wept for 40 days straight after dropping a loaf of bread. No one is quite sure where he got that from. Possibly a misunderstanding of a parable or a loaf-related metaphor gone rogue. Meanwhile, the librarian is trying to locate a scroll that might clarify all this, though he keeps getting distracted by the illustrations, which include a camel trying to hold an umbrella. The camel appears unimpressed. You feel the same. Historians still argue whether the shape of natural objects like rain snowflakes or even mountains was meant to convey divine order or simply to baffle peasants into reverence. Some sources suggest that symmetry was revered for its own sake. Others claim that chaos was closer to God's original design and humans simply couldn't handle it, so they projected patterns wherever possible, like finding angels in burnt toast. One of the more meticulous scholars, a specialist in zoological rainfalls, interrupts the ongoing debate to read aloud from a 7th century compilation on anomalous weather. Apparently once in central Armenia it rained frogs, and the survivors describe them as oddly well-formed. This does not help the conversation, but it certainly changes the mood. You look around the room. It's comfortably dim, lit by oil lamps that cast flickering golden circles on the walls. Somewhere someone is crushing cloves with unnecessary drama. The air smells like philosophy and slightly burnt cumin. A young student tentatively raises a hand and says, "Perhaps the shape doesn't matter. Perhaps it's the movement that defines the raindrop." Like a soul or a particularly ambitious goat, he's promptly applauded and then asked to fetch more water, which he does with pride. The argument has now shifted to the relationship between raindrop velocity and moral alignment. According to one increasingly hoarse theologian, fast drops indicate divine urgency. Slow ones suggest reflection, or perhaps divine hesitation. No one can decide whether drizzle is passive-aggressive or just tired. You quietly vote for both. Through it all, the brazier crackles and the dates disappear. Someone's ink pot tips over and they try to pretend it's symbolic. Another scholar tries to mimic the shape of a raindrop with his hands and ends up inventing a new bird. It's not clear when the conversation moves from debate to storytelling, but at some point people begin sharing personal rain memories. Times they were caught in storms, blessed by light showers during prayers, or nearly flattened by hail the size of figs. One elderly scholar confesses he once tried to collect raindrops on individual tiles to prove their uniformity. He failed mostly due to wind and cats. This leads to a whole aside about medieval weather instruments. Did you know some Abbasid engineers built early rain gauges out of glass cylinders and goat hair? Of course you didn't. No one talks about that at parties, but here it's considered top-shelf gossip, especially when someone points out that goat hair swells when wet, which may have rendered most readings completely unreliable. You begin to understand the appeal, not the accuracy, but the ritual. The way everyone leans in not to win but to wonder. The way silence falls gently between statements like a mist, not a void. A bowl of quince jam is passed around and the conversation slows to a dreamy trickle. There's now a general agreement that raindrops, like most truths, are likely unknowable, and anyone claiming certainty is either selling something or writing a book. You sit back, the scent of cloves still lingering, and listen to the wind against the latticework. The rain has returned soft, tentative. One scholar raises a finger and declares that this must be the ethical phase of the rain, a drizzle of conscience. Everyone nods as if that makes perfect sense. Outside, the stone courtyard gleams in the moonlight. Inside, the debate has morphed into a group lullaby of overlapping half-theories and suspended logic. It's not important what shape the raindrop is anymore. What matters is that it fell, that you noticed, and that someone was willing to write 4 scrolls about it. You feel sleep tugging at the edge of your awareness, a slow exhale wrapped in wool. The last thing you hear before nodding off is someone proposing a new thesis that rain is just the sky's way of reminding us to stop thinking and start listening. You think they may be right. By now, the debate has drifted, as all good medieval discussions do, into something entirely unrelated but somehow still connected. You're seated near the stove in a modest side chamber of the observatory, listening to an anecdote about a bishop who once refused to sleep unless a bowl of water was placed beside his bed. Not to drink, just to reflect moonlight so he'd know if the night had been emotionally turbulent. You nod slowly. You've heard stranger. Tonight's topic, spinning out of the earlier raindrop deliberations, is moisture in general, and more specifically dew. A quiet, passive cousin to rain, and according to at least one wandering friar, an earthly whisper from the stars. You're not sure that makes sense, but it does sound nice. In one corner, a scholar with suspiciously shiny boots is explaining a fringe theory that dew forms wherever the sky weeps gently in its sleep. According to this belief, mountains, particularly the Alps, collect more dew not because of altitude or temperature, but because they're closer to heaven's pillow. You're tempted to argue, but your mouth is full of stewed lentils, and honestly, that theory isn't the weirdest one tonight. The senior astrologer, who has a beard like a pine cone and smells faintly of nutmeg and defiance, argues that dew is actually the Earth's own breath. If the stars are watching us, he says, surely the soil must exhale from time to time. He also claims he once tasted the dew on a sacred fig tree and had dreams about celestial goats for a week. This goes unchallenged, for now. Historians still argue whether dew was more feared or revered in medieval natural philosophy. Some claimed it was a vital life force, a healing balm drawn directly from the heavens. Others insisted it was the residue of demonic whispers best wiped away before sunrise. There's even a minor heretical sect that believed sleeping near a dew-covered field made your dreams easier for angels to intercept, sort of like mailing your subconscious via damp parchment. Naturally, this leads to a lengthy discussion about dream navigation and the dangers of sleeping in the wrong cardinal direction. Someone brings up the ancient Alpine taboo against sleeping with your feet pointing south. You perk up a bit. This finally is familiar territory. Sort of. The taboo is old. Older than roads, some claim. Older than monasteries, maybe. And no one can quite agree why it existed, only that it did, particularly in the Alpine villages nestled between cliff and cloud. You picture one now, a crooked line of wooden cottages pressed against the sloped slate roofs glinting under frost, and the uneasy feeling that the mountain might one day slide a little closer. You can almost hear the wind. Anyway, the southern sleeping fear. It turns out there are many reasons offered. The most common is geomancy, that the southern slope channels cold air and restless spirits, and sleeping with your head pointed toward it invites strange dreams and bad luck. One local proverb translated loosely to southwards, "You slip northwards, you rise." No one could agree if this meant anything practical, but it certainly sounded ominous. Another theory proposed now by a scholar chewing absently on a stick of cinnamon is that the sun's rise and fall had symbolic meaning. Facing south in sleep was seen as disrespecting the dawn. You're not sure the sun cares, but try telling that to someone who once woke up with frostbite and a crow nesting in their hood. There's also the agricultural interpretation. In certain mountain regions, animal shelters were built with doors facing east for morning light and afternoon shade. By extension, humans aligned themselves accordingly. Sleeping southward put you out of sync with livestock rhythms, and in an agrarian society that was basically declaring war on your own chickens. As the theories pile up, the mood grows contemplative. Someone dims the lamps. Another begins sketching a rough map of alpine ley lines in the ash on the hearth. You watch a moth land near the candlewick and wonder how many nights have passed exactly like this. Just people, firelight, and slightly ridiculous ideas, shared with too much seriousness to interrupt. One scholar now insists the whole sleeping direction taboo stems from old burial customs, that to face south was to align with the resting position of the dead. You nearly spit out your lentils. A few heads nod solemnly. Suddenly, it's all clicking into place. Of course, the dead don't get up. They face south. So maybe you shouldn't lie like them unless you're planning on staying that way. A dry voice adds, "My uncle once fell asleep facing south and woke up with a sore neck and 3 lost goats." The story doesn't go further. It doesn't have to. By now, the fire is mostly coals. Outside, the wind scrapes along the shutters in lazy intervals. Someone pours thick, slightly gritty tea into mismatched mugs. You cradle yours, feeling the heat bloom against your palms. There's a quiet moment as someone gently snores into their sleeve. Another pulls a blanket over their knees and mutters something about the melancholy hour. You're not sure what that means, but it suits the mood. A younger monk, too eager but likable, offers a final thought. What if the fear of sleeping south was just a metaphor for drifting too far into yourself, for choosing isolation over community, shadow over sun? No one laughs. Not because it's profound, but because it might be, and no one wants to ruin the illusion. You finish your tea. The last embers settle with a sigh. And in this warm, drowsy corner of the world, beneath a roof older than some kingdoms, you let your eyes close. Not southward, of course. Just safely sideways. Morning returns, though morning is generous. The Alps aren't known for their punctual sunrises, especially in winter. Light trickles in like a hungover rooster, late sulky and a little uneven. You're wrapped in a woolen cloak someone draped over your shoulders during the night, and the hearth has been rekindled by a novice who only slightly burned his sleeve in the process. You stretch slowly, carefully. No one mentions that you fell asleep sitting up. No one mentions that you dreamt of ribboned fish humming in Latin. The conversation surprisingly hasn't ended. It has only migrated to the library alcove, where a collection of manuscripts is now under enthusiastic but very gentle attack. You join them quietly, sipping something thick and dark that might be coffee or might be boiled bark again. The difference is academic at this point. A vellum scroll is unrolled across the table. On it, a strange diagram, a human figure drawn in red ink surrounded by curling lines pointing to various organs and labeled with curious symbols, moons, roots, birds. It's a medieval sleep chart, not for diagnosing sleep disorders, but for decoding spiritual alignment. At the bottom in faded script, "Let no man slumber in southern posture lest the sky take notice," a warning, or maybe a suggestion. Either way, it adds fuel to the growing theory that sleeping south wasn't just inconvenient, it was noticed. That's the real issue, you realize, not what happens when you sleep facing south, but that something might see you do it. Because medieval people, for all their superstitions and mistranslations, weren't foolish. They simply understood that being alive meant being vulnerable, and lying flat on your back, unmoving, mouth slightly open, that's about as vulnerable as it gets. Facing south might feel like turning your face toward mystery, or worse, toward responsibility. Someone now recounts a tale from an obscure Swiss folktale collection, a shepherd who fell asleep on a south-facing slope and woke up convinced he'd heard the stars whispering. Not singing, whispering. They'd told him to plant garlic upside down. He did, and it thrived. The village, however, did not. Another story, this one from a crumbling codex you're gently squinting at, mentions a mountain inn where every guest who slept facing south awoke with the same dream, being watched by a goat in a bishop's mitre. The inn no longer exists, probably for the best. Historians still argue whether such myths were allegories, misremembered weather patterns, or simply the product of fermented barley. Some say they reflect the medieval fear of the unknown. Others suggest they were invented by local innkeepers who wanted everyone sleeping the same way to avoid awkward furniture arrangements. There is amusingly one account of a noblewoman who insisted on sleeping southward out of a sheer spite. She believed that anything everyone else feared must be hiding something valuable. So she commissioned a bed that could pivot on a central post like a sundial for stubbornness, and spent each night gradually rotating. Her servants loathed it, but she lived to 83 and swore the trick to long life was never obeying cartographers. You imagine her now wrapped in fur, staring defiantly into the invisible breeze, daring the sky to blink first. A fellow listener beside you lets out a contented sigh. It's not really about the direction, is it? He says half to himself. It's about control. Pretending we get to choose which way the world turns. You nod. Maybe. Or maybe it's just that cold air sinks and southern-facing rooms are drafty. Someone else now insists, only half-joking, that southward sleep makes your dreams heavier, denser, like porridge left out too long. North poles, he explains. South sinks. You've heard worse metaphors. You've made worse metaphors. Meanwhile, the friar who reads too much Dante is scribbling furiously in a journal, muttering something about sleep as a metaphor for the Last Judgment. You carefully don't ask. Some doors aren't meant to be opened before lunch. The candlelight catches the edge of a silver clasp on one of the books. You stare at it for a moment. It looks like a tiny mountain. You wonder if someone somewhere made a miniature Alps just to carry in their pocket. It wouldn't be the strangest thing you've encountered this week. You realize you're enjoying this far more than you expected. Not the myths themselves, but the ritual of decoding them, the slow, spiraling logic of a culture that feared the wind but trusted dreams. That mapped superstition as earnestly as they mapped rivers and believed every shadow had a name. It's deeply irrational. It's quietly comforting. And so, as the scroll is gently rolled back into its case, and someone begins preparing a pot of something that smells suspiciously like mushrooms and caramel, you make your decision. Tonight, you'll sleep facing west, just in case. You've made it to evening again, though time has become less a matter of clocks and more a matter of how many cups of bark tea you've endured without complaint. The sky outside is the color of old wool, and every chimney in the mountain town seems to exhale at once, curling little smoke trails upward like prayers that forgot where they were going. Inside, the hearth is crackling again, louder than it needs to because someone slipped pine cones into the kindling for flavor. You're reclining now, comfortably swaddled in a worn tapestry someone repurposed into a blanket. It smells faintly of beeswax, rosemary, and 1,000 previous conversations. A new voice takes over the story now, older, gentler, with the kind of tone that suggests they've seen a goat perform mass once and were only mildly surprised. The topic, animals and how they sleep in the Alps. It seems like a non sequitur until it very much isn't. Apparently, goats sleep facing uphill, always. It's not superstition, it's balance. Should a rock slide occur or a wind blow too hard, their instinct is to spring forward into the slope, not down it. We could learn from that, the voice says, and the room nods as though this is profound. Maybe it is. Maybe that's the entire point of medieval myth, find the goat and do what it does. This segues naturally, though slowly, into a legend about a hermit who lived in a hollowed-out pine trunk and swore he was never ill so long as his toes pointed toward the nearest glacier. You raise an eyebrow. He may have just been cold all the time. Still, there's something poetic about aligning oneself with the ancient, icy heart of a mountain and saying yes that way. That's where my dreams should go. Historians still argue whether such orientations had any measurable benefit. Some suggest sleeping toward a glacier might offer marginal temperature control, useful in regulating sleep in cramped wooden huts. Others point out that most people just slept wherever the clean straw was, and the rest is storytelling layered on top like frosting on a very dry loaf of barley bread. Another account surfaces this time involving a row of monastery bunks mysteriously shifted 1 inch each night by a well-meaning novice convinced that the abbot was absorbing too much lunar energy. No one stopped him for weeks. Eventually, he was given his own room and a large stack of sheep-related reading material. There's laughter, soft and communal, the kind you only hear late at night when no one's trying to impress anyone anymore. It fizzles gently under the weight of shared warmth and quiet fatigue. You're asked kindly without pressure what direction you usually sleep in back home. You consider it, north probably, but only because your headboard is bolted to a wall that doesn't leak. You say this out loud. Everyone nods sagely as though you've just delivered a proverb. A candle gutters nearby, then steadies itself. The light dims, narrows, becomes more gold than white. You're slipping now, not into sleep, not yet, but into that other state. The one where myths start to make more sense than tax law, and you find yourself genuinely wondering if your dreams have been heavier lately. Someone murmurs about the ribboned fish again. You imagine it swimming lazily beneath the ice bell, tinkling softly in the dark. Not magical, just strange, but sometimes strange is enough. You think of all the ways people have tried to explain the world while half asleep. Shadowy folktales, whispered warnings, weird drawings of sleep positions next to herbal diagrams, not to terrify, but to reassure. Because fear in the right wrapping becomes tradition. And tradition, when passed gently from hand to hand, becomes comfort. That's what the myth of Southern sleep has become. Not a rule, not a threat, just a gentle nudge. Maybe turn your pillow, maybe angle your dreams northward tonight, just to be safe. You exhale deeply. The air smells of stone and soot and something faintly sweet, dried apples maybe. Someone refills the kettle, someone else draws the curtain back a finger's width to watch the snow settle on the cobbled path below. There is no great conclusion, no thunderous truth, just a collection of very old stories passed between very tired people who no longer need them to be accurate, just soothing. You pull the tapestry a little higher and let your eyes fall shut. Not facing south, just because.